this is Second World War internment, and it's very much different to what happened in America and Canada. We know that at the start of 1941, after Pearl Harbor, there were 500 Japanese left in England, mainly in the London area. Of the 500, 114 were interned, and they were taken to either two places. If they were businessmen, or if they were diplomats working for the embassy, they were sent to the Isle of Man, which is a small island in the Irish Sea between Ireland and England. Isle of Man. We've got some pictures here of the Isle of Man. The camp was called the Palace Camp. It was in a hotel. It was called the Taplow Hotel. And they had quite a nice time there. In actual fact, they had their own chefs cooking food. They had film shows. They could go for walks along the seaside. As long as they had the guard with them, it was okay. Newspapers, cigarettes, card games, anything that they wanted, soft drinks they could buy, whatever they wanted. The rest of them, the seamen, there were a lot of sailors there, the merchant seamen. They were sent to this place in Scotland, which is quite, it was in the middle of nowhere, so a little bit like Canada in a way. That period, they didn't have such a bad time there either. They had food, and they were looked after reasonably well. Of the 114, 66 were repatriated. Very few left. There's like 30 or something, 30 or 40 only left, and they were quite happy to stay there. They were offered the chance to return to Japan, but they said no, we'll stay here. More happy staying there, apparently. Yeah, but what they did was they held these people in internment because they wanted to exchange them for prisoners in Japan. So the diplomats and businessmen that were being held in Japan, they could exchange them. But the problem is that a lot of the businessmen in London, Japanese, didn't want to go back. Their children were sent back. There are records of some children being sent back who were then put in the Japanese army. They couldn't speak Japanese. It was a really strange situation at that time. Atani Masataru was detained. The judo teacher, he was detained, but then he was released after 3 months thanks to petitioning by his wife and friends. Mishiku Sensei was also detained, and according to what Frank Perry told me, he said that he was sent to Wales to teach British Armed Forces unarmed combat, but he refused, saying that he wouldn't train British soldiers to kill Japanese people, and the kind of military insisted, but he said no, he wouldn't do it, and eventually they released him. And then for the rest of the war, he and his wife said they were Chinese. If ever they were asked, they said they were Chinese to avoid any confrontation. But it's interesting because if there were 500 Japanese in London and England at that time, and 114 were only detained, that leaves like 380 odd Japanese just allowed to continue with their life in London. We know, as I say, Koizumi Sensei was not detained. He had maybe some friends in high places, or the fact that he had been extremely supportive of the community in London. With he had an ambulance kind of a group in the First World War, and then he had a business that wasn't reliant on specifically Japanese clientele, so he was allowed to continue. He had an aliens card, but he wasn't locked up. Tani was also not interned, but he was not very well at that time. But he again kind of had employment from the Budokwai. So it's interesting that they were not kind of locked up. It seems like it was fairly a lot freer than people would have thought in London at that time. Yeah. So following on from the Second World War, we have Kendo restarting, and this is a kind of an interesting period too, because you have the, I'm sure John Bowen recognizes the London Judo Society there, picture of George Chu and Eric Dominy,
Yeah.
the two founders of the London Judo Society. And it was here that Roald Knudsen was practicing judo. And one day he opened some cupboards and found a kendo armor inside there. And he started then his pursuit of kendo, which was a little bit rough, to say the least. They were practicing with pieces of dowel, long pieces of wood. They didn't have shinai, and they didn't have any books, and they had no teachers. And it was only through the influence of Hata Sensei saw them and saw how serious they were, that he decided to help them and make contact with the newly formed All Japan Kendo Federation. But before that, in 1955, we have the arrival of Abe Kenshiro Sensei. And I am always somewhat in awe of this gentleman. It's strange because many people regarded him as a little bit crazy, but he had the pedigree big time. He had such a persona of martial arts. He was a student of the Busen. He was his kendo. He was taught by Ogawa Kinosuke. He had 6 dan in kendo when he came to the UK. He was awarded 8 dan in judo. I think that was not obviously from the Kodokan, that was from the Busen, I think. And he also was a personal student of Yoshiba Sensei. He met Yoshiba on a train, and the old man, Yoshiba, said to him, "Do you know who I am?" And he said, "No, I don't know who you are." And he said, "Do you know who I am? I'm the great Kenshiro Abe." And Morihei Yoshiba said, "Hold my finger." And he took his finger, and Abe Sensei ended up on the floor, and he couldn't understand how this old man could do that. So then he requested that he became a student, and I think he was a student for 10 years. And he introduced Aikido to the UK as well. So I'm quite in awe of this gentleman. I think he was definitely the real McCoy. You know, there are the strange stories about how he behaved, etc., which may be the result of his military service, maybe post-traumatic stress. We don't know exactly, but he was quite something. And what happened was, when he arrived, he was living with Masataro Otani in his house, and he started to teach his son Tomio Otani, started to teach him in Kendo and Aikido. So Tomio Otani is before Knudsen ever touched the shinai. Tomio was practicing with Abe Sensei every day, wearing armor, using shinai, and if you he wrote several articles on Kendo. He wrote a book, part of a book, and the Kendo in there is quite amazing. Even now, it stands up much above Lidsten's book that came out slightly before that. So Tomio Otani was also the real thing as far as Kendo was concerned, and he became a kind of nemesis for Knudsen, because as Knudsen was quite clever, because through the All Japan Kendo Federation, he was able to establish the British Kendo Association, European Kendo Federation, And there were issues with Abe Sensei. He had a car accident. He had to go back to Japan. The organizations that he founded didn't progress very well, but Knutsen's did. And so the British Kendo Association was formed. And but Tomio Otani was always the nemesis for Knutsen. Knutsen was always worried that Tomio was going to steal his students, or any visiting Japanese would go and practice with Tomio rather than with his people. So that was kind of something that happened at the time. The problem was that Abe Sensei had been invited to the London Judo Society in 1955 by, I guess, George Chu and Eric Dominy, but they kind of fell out very quickly. Abe Sensei felt that they were not giving him the due respect, so he left, and he started to teach at the hut in West Drayton, which we've got, I think, some pictures. Abe Sensei started at this hut, which was at the back of a pub in Hillingdon, and he started to teach judo there and aikido, and they were doing a little bit of kendo. And he formed these organizations: the International Budo Council, the British Judo Council, the British Kendo Council, the British Karate Council. Every council that you could possibly think of, he formed. And Tomio Otani was running around the country teaching kendo to various people. So there we have Abe Kenshiro Sensei there on the top left and bottom left. In the middle there is Ogawa Kinosuke, top left of the picture, next to Mochida, and there's Saimura there, and Nakayama Hakudo and Sasaburo Takano in that picture. There's the hut at the bottom of the slide. That's the hut at this back of this pub in Hillingdon. It's still there, apparently. There's people still practicing there, as I understand. And this amazing picture, I look at this Sonkyo of Abe Sensei. I find that quite amazing. For us Kendo people, that Sonkyo is something, I think. It really is. Anyway, I'm sorry, I get wrapped up in that. So Abe Sensei arrived in 55. He stayed until 1964. He went back for the Olympics. And then he went back to Japan, never to return again. He got disillusioned with the situation in the UK. The organization, the International Budo Council, people that he'd left behind ripped him off. He couldn't actually get any satisfaction out of them, so he went back to Japan and kind of died sadly in some kind of obscurity in actual fact. So I think highly underrated martial artist in this country, although a lot of people do hold him in high respect. There are some, of course, as I say, some wacky stories about him. He was driving through the countryside and they passed a field with a horse in it, and he said, "Oh, I like to do that," and he jumps out and he got on the horse and was riding around the horse. But then again, he was in the army, and we understand that he may have had some kind of instruction in horse riding. He also had other expectations of being able to break railway sleepers and things like this with his hands, but that didn't kind of work out. But he definitely, as I say, had something. He had the pedigree for sure. So I think a little bit underrated. Anyway, just my feelings. Can we go up or down again, Jack? Sorry, can we see? Okay, so this is Shintoru. Shintoru was the name that Knutsen gave to the dojo in the London Judo Society. This is inside there. Top right is Takizawa Sensei, Kozo. was a big supporter of British Kendo. He also, we can trace him back to Charles Boxer in 1931. Standing in the picture here is Lidston, R.A. Lidston. Next to him is Jock Hobson. And then we've got a picture left inside the practice. And if we go to the video, 1962, we can actually see them doing their stuff. So the man in the mask is Lidston, R.A. Lidston himself. And there you got Knudsen left-hand side. A very young Roald Knudsen. I think he's now 85. So this is 1962. Lidston demonstrating. Started Kendo 1931, as you will see. Yeah. So wild and wacky Kendo from that period for sure.
Actually, Budden Sensei, we do have one question. Sherlock Investigates asks, is there a significance to the way they've tied their men in the previous video?
Yeah, there's different applications that we see, and some of it is ignorance, and some of it is actually specifics, because we can see from various films from different periods around the world, Japan, Singapore, America, etc., the different ways of tying the men. So you often see men himo that look like a chain, and there was some explanation from Nagal Sensei about that. It was a way that they felt it was stronger to do the himo, to almost to plait it like a chain. And then you see people tying the men himo without a bow. They just tie it in a knot, and the himo just hang at the back in certain periods as well. And of course, then you have the difference. Kansai Kanto used to tie differently, so they would tie across the mendare at the bottom, and there are variations on that as well that we see. So I think it's only really since the All Japan Kendo Federation kind of standardized a pattern that we follow, that everything is, of course, needs to be the same length, facing the different way, how it was. But I think in the earlier periods, it was very, very different. I think it depended on where you came from and how it was. We can see in the very early pictures the length of the hakama, how short it was, in some instances, how long the shinai was in compared. The standardization, I think, took place over several years. So there was a variety. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. It's interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Next one. So here we have Roald Knudsen with various people. influences. We have top right is Etsuko Horie, a young lady that arrived in 1964. She arrived, and she was detained at customs for a shinai. We wouldn't let her in until she explained what they were for. She was like second dan. She wasn't an extremely high level person, but she had been introduced to Knudsen and to Benjamin Hazard in America. And through Kozo Takizawa, in the picture on the right, the young picture of Kozo Sensei, she arrived in the UK to stay for 1 year, and she was kind of astounded by the exuberance and passion of the Kendo people, and yet they were still wearing their kekogi outside of their hakama, and kind of was a bit odd. And they were very experienced they knew all about the Kurosawa movies, and some of them collected swords and stuff, and they didn't know very much about Kendo. So she tried to help them during her stay in London, and then she visited Sweden with Knudsen Sensei. He had a big relationship with Robert van Sondo, founder of the Swedish Kendo Federation and also the European Kendo Federation. And then she went back to Japan. A couple of years later, she went back to Sweden, and she stayed there for the rest of her life. She was instrumental in helping Swedish Kendo. Other people, bottom left is Ozawa Sensei. He also helped very much with British Kendo, Ninth Dan. We, of course, know his son from the Black Book, the Kendo book. Ozawa Hiroshi Sensei, his son. And there's Knudsen in the middle with two Japanese. One is from Belgium, was resident. The other one, Chiga, was in France. Top picture in the middle is the Ninth Dan, first Ninth Dan to come to the UK. And then there's our wild friend Lidston on the left, probably from the same video. Okay, moving down to the next slide. So here we have the 50 years legacy of the Budokwai chart. And we can see 1918, formation of the Budokwai. Still in existence today, but without Kendo. 1946, we have the London Judo Society, and that then filters into the Shinto route with Hudson, which leads into the British Kendo Association. And then 1966 to 68, we have the first dojos in the UK, which were not just in London, they were situated around the country, different places. Some of them exist, some of them don't anymore. And then we have Anglo-Japanese Judo Society. Busen martial arts still exist, but without Kendo. And then if we go down to the next slide, we should have a crossover. So here we have the names of the people that were involved with the various groups. And if we go down to the next one, we can see that no, not that one. Sorry. Should be another one. Okay, here we can see the how they crossed over. And for example, Lidston started at the Anglo-Japanese, and then he went to the Shinto route after some quite period, 30 odd years nearly. We've got also Abe Sensei coming into the Anglo-Japanese there. He was, after the London Judo Society, he was practicing with Mishiku. So there's a crossover there. And you can see in the middle all the organizations that Abe Sensei formed at that time. Tomio Otani was in charge of the British Kendo Council. There's the one odd one is Kendo Kagamashin, which is still in existence. It's a member of the British Kendo Association. It was originally in the British Kendo Association, but there was a split in '73 when Knudsen left, and he formed the British Kendo Reme, and the Kagamashin went with him at that time, and then came back to the British Kendo Association. And there's a kind of a list of people who were involved, various instructors at the time, 1966. Some of them are still with us, some of them sadly not. So Knudsen moved to the Brighton Dojo from London. He was originally, as I said, a Shinto-ryu. John Sparks is still around. Apparently Victor Cook is still with us. He doesn't do Kendo anymore, does the Iaido. Eric Pleasance is an interesting guy. Maybe John, you might know about this guy, Eric Pleasance. No? He is called Hitler's Bastard. There's a book called Hitler's Bastard. He was, I think, I'm not quite sure exactly, because I don't have the information on him, but he was in prison, I think, in Jersey, and was offered the chance to join the German army, which he did. And then he was captured by the Russians, and then he was in the Russian army. Anyway, he was eventually released and returned to the UK, and then he started doing martial arts, etc. But there's a book, I think it's called Hitler's Bastard. It's quite an interesting book. But very strange guy to have doing Kendo and Judo with you, I would have thought, you know. Green lines is obviously World War One, Manchurian Incident, and World War Two. So those are the main three periods that we're kind of dividing up this chart to show where people were. Budokwai, of course, lists Koizumi Sensei and Sonobe as the two main instructors from 1918, Ashida, and then Okamoto, Kuzutani, Nogi, and Otani. If we look at from the Manchurian incident, when we look at the lists, the shift was from Japanese to British practitioners more than had been previous, and that was mainly because of the anti-Japanese feeling at the time. Budokwai did continue during the war. It didn't actually shut down completely. It shut down for a while, and I think John can verify that. They started it up again for self-defense for the forces, I think, something like that.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so next, can we go down, Zach? As should be something else. It should be okay. So top right is a Fuji Sensei. Okumitsu arrived in London in 1967. And another interesting person. He had worked for a stage promotion company in Japan. He had looked after people on tour, musicians, so mainly kind of jazz people to start with, and then the Rolling Stones, and then the Beatles and stuff. And I interviewed him. We interviewed him a few years ago, and when he started talking about the Beatles, of course, I got very interested. And he knew Paul McCartney and John Lennon. He had met them in Japan, looked after them, and he said, yeah, they were kind of nice guys, interesting guys. What he did remember was having to buy 50,000 bento boxes to pay for the security guards that lined the airport, from the airport to the hotel when the Beatles arrived. All the police and everything was like, had to buy all these bento boxes. Anyway, he arrived in the UK. He was a friend of became very friendly with a drummer of a band called Blue Mink, who were very popular in the UK in the 60s, and they became their manager. And he was walking in the street one day, saw Knudsen carrying his armor, and he approached him and said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to Kendo." "Oh," he said, "I do Kendo." And he was fifth dan. And so Knudsen immediately collared him, and he started to be very much part of British Kendo, and established several dojos in the UK. Was notorious for practicing with a pint of Guinness in one hand and a shinai in the other, amongst other things. But it was very, very good. And if we can watch this video, you can see his level, and not just of Kendo, but of Iaido as well. So this is in Bristol. There was a dojo in Bristol. There still is a dojo in Bristol, which is in the West Country. It's just on the bridge where they go across into Wales. In the days when we built ships and things in Bristol, by the look of it, I think. Yeah. Okay, so here we have the dojo, no doubt. I say if you can watch these videos at the kind of normal speed, they obviously are somewhat different, but you can get the gist of what the level is here. I have no idea who the gentleman on the right is at all. He lived in Penzance for the remainder of his life, and when we contacted him to go down and visit him, we said, "Where will you be?" He said, "Oh, you'll see me. I'm beyond the seafront." He said, "You won't miss me." Of course, I knew him a long time. Anyway, when we arrived and we drove up in the car, he was wearing a red wig with a tartan hat, which was quite bizarre. So he was also a very eccentric person too. But in his early days, he was quite something, really, really. You can see the way he's tied his men there. The question about the men, his men is not tied at the back. They didn't have the idea about having the loops the same length. So some did, but some didn't. That was very much hack and bash in those days. Okay, so I think that's about it for the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions. As I say, kind of skipped over some stuff, but if you have any things you'd like to ask, please do so.
I have some question.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Is the British Kendo history is the oldest one in Europe, among European country?
Yeah, we think so.
Is that maybe because of the Japan and British had alliance?
Unfortunately, Sensei, you kind of maybe missed the first part, but when we look at the lineage of involvement, if we go back to, let's go back. Well, we had this British guy called Thomas McClatchy. So Thomas McClatchy was a student of Sakikibara Kenkichi. Yeah, and he took part in the Gekkenkai in 1873 in Tokyo. In Ueno in Tokyo, there was a Gekkenkai, and McClatchy took part in that Gekkenkai. He was a student of Sakikibara Kenkichi, so he is the first British person to learn Gekkenkai or Gekken or Kenjutsu, if you want to call it what it was before Kendo. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's the first person, and then of course you have the as I said, the other people coming after him. F.J. Norman, the British Army officer who also studied in Japan. And then we have the first demonstration of Gekken in 1885 in London.
1885.
Yeah, the first demonstration of Gekken. And then on the formation of the Budokwai in 1918, that's when Kendo started to be taught.
Okay.
Yeah. So as far as I know, there are no no European countries that started before that time. In America, of course, yes, it started before. And I'm not sure about Canada. What was your year in Canada when you started the Kendo?
Well, before 1890.
Yeah. yeah.
Somewhere around there that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah. So I mean, Brazil, Hawaii, Canada, America, obviously before in the New World. But in Europe, I think it's definitely UK. I didn't find any records to dispute that fact that we started before. We can't find anything in France before the Second World War.
Oh,
I can't.
really?
There's some talk about Germany, but we think it was more judo. Bales, the doctor, also a student of Sakura Kichi, but we don't think that he introduced Gekken to Germany. So we don't think there may have been some Russians. We don't know, but as far as we know, yeah.
Thank you very much.